display. So thank you all for coming to this event in the Department of English, Rhetoric, and Writing's reading series. Today's reading is sponsored by Berry College and the Georgia Poetry Circuit. It's my honor to introduce to you poet and photographer Rachel Eliza Griffiths. Rachel Eliza Griffiths received her MFA in creative writing from Sarah Lawrence College and is a recipient of fellowships from Yaddo, Provincetown Fine Arts Work Center, Kavikanan Foundation, the Malay Colony, and others. Her literary and visual work has been widely published, including in Poets and Writers, the New York Times, Callaloo, American Poetry Review, Black Nature, 4 Centuries of African American Nature Poetry, and many others. She's widely known for her literary portraits, fine art photography, and lyric videos. Griffiths recently completed an extensive video project, POP, Poets on Poetry, an intimate series of micro-interviews, which gathers nearly 100 contemporary poets in conversation and is featured online at the Academy of American Poets website. Recently, Griffiths was selected by the Poetry Society of America to curate the Poetry Walk, featuring the poetry of Octavio Paz for the New York Botanical Gardens exhibit, Frida Kahlo, Art, Garden, Life. Griffiths is the author of 4 books of poems, Miracle Arrhythmia, The Requited Distance, Mule and Pear, selected for the 2012 Inaugural Poetry Award by the Black Caucus of the American Library Association, and most recently, Lighting the Shadow. Currently, Griffiths teaches creative writing at Sarah Lawrence College and the Institute of American Indian Arts. She lives in Brooklyn, New York. Chiaroscuro, the dramatic effect of contrasting light and dark, one of Griffiths' favorite visual devices, is a technique, she writes, of both mystery and absolute intimacy, evoking the subtlety of the living world and her relationship with it. Griffiths' poems, like her photographs, are suffused by light and shadow, full of figures ghosted by history. The dead will lead you across scarred meadows, red, blue, white. So begins her remarkable new collection. In elegiac poems at once surreal and heartbreakingly real, Griffiths remembers the victims of many terrors, both at home and abroad. The Boston Marathon bombing, women sexually assaulted in every continent, murdered in so-called honor killings, an American history of lynchings blurring into the present, where racial killings continue. And every week's news seems to bring word of another black boy, another black man shot at a traffic stop, at a park, on a sidewalk, simply walking home. In her poem Elegy, which she dedicates to Trayvon Martin and too many others, Griffiths writes, I remember the boys and their open hands, high fives of farewell. The speaker also remembers more boys knelt and swung through the air. This swinging might be child's play in a different history, but this is a savage field. And she writes, I remember how their eyes rolled back in blood, milk, and gasoline. The faces of our death are unresolved, Griffiths tells us, but the voices are not lost. This is one power of art, of this art, to call us to be better than our amnesia. This world is lit or shadowed by how we attend to it, and giving voice to the voiceless, these poems fill with light. I pulled their lives from the trees and lawns and schools. I won't leave them, Griffiths writes. I am the shriek, the suture, the petal, shook. her silence. Please welcome Rachel Eliza Griffiths.
Good afternoon, how are you? Good? I'm really happy to be here. I'm delighted, really. This is the last stop on the Georgia Poetry Circuit Tour for me for the fall season, and I'll visit southern Georgia in the spring. But I've been looking forward to being here. Everyone I've spoken with and interacted with this week has said, Barry College is so beautiful, it's this, it's that, wait till you go to Barry, and everyone has been right. So I'm really happy to be here with you. Thank you so much, Barry College community, for having me, for all of you being here and coming to listen to poetry. Thank you so much, Sandy, for being so warm, and thank you for that introduction, which now has my eyes kind of tingling with tears. So thank you, I appreciate that, I appreciate your poetry. So I thought I'd read a few poems, and if any of you had some questions or things you might want to share and have a dialogue, we could do that. And then maybe you'll want to check out the embodiment exhibition that's happening in the gallery, where I'll also be. So I'm going to jump around a little through various books of mine, and when I need to tell you something that will help you access and hear the poem, I will. I've often spoken this week to different students about what I call HAS, which is human attention span, as far as like listening when someone is speaking at you, and so I'll be mindful of that. This poem is from my first collection, Miracle Arrhythmia. It's called Portrait, Waking as a Girl, and it's from my father. Even then, I recognized the drift. Even then, as I awoke during those years to girlhood. Beyond words, I mean the blizzard of senses that overwhelmed language. From dreams to the silent gray of winter, I did not speak. My waking depended on the myrrh of my father's aftershave to guide my eyes into focus. My father, in a charcoal suit, his gold wedding band wet from the single splash of water that rinsed his face after he used Listerine. From the nocturne ghosts to the geography of a pillow, the scent of my father arrived to wake me. Between the wooden burrow and the creaking radiators, I stumbled to the bathroom's tunnel of light. And when I could not, having become a woman, understand much of my father's life, I relied on the old musk that clung to the collars of my father's suits, the closets that I opened to become his little girl again, when no one, including him, thought I cared. How I chased the silent essence of my father's sacrifices and my own miserable independence. How, even now, my dark head mourns him on its pillow in an empty room. Fragments of poems I would like to give you on your birthday. And this is a post. Oh, do you have? Sorry. I won't do it again. I'll try not to do it again because it's so bad. I would call this a post-love poem, which means it's a little sad. Fragments of poems I would like to give you on your birthday. If we missed a season, it was spring. Didn't we start on a haunted lake, against our better selves, Didn't we sheaf fall and winter into letters? And weren't those summer ghosts nodding mischief into our imperfect mirrors? If I miss burdens, they are the licks of your dark hair against your ears, blue sunrise sheets whitening against your legs. Didn't we try to walk together on a straight line in cities made of circles and squares? If I miss God's voice, it is yours, rising and slowing into crawls against static page and ear. Didn't my voice shift between yours as a body does? Didn't our gods have a good laugh? If I reflect on these 3 seasons we have shared, I must at least account for last spring, where I looked into orange petals for your face, where I asked the river of your absence. Didn't I question you about all of this, my sad and useful melancholy? If I have crowned your head with my lips, made palaces of your silvering temples, didn't we know such monarchies were built with bones and tongues? And the fidelity of our words, didn't we know that words would be all of this absurd republic? Would our villages be so clearly vacant now? If I have gathered apology and memory into the night as a woman does gather her hair against her bare shoulders, and if that woman sits by prophecy in a corner and rolls her tears into her own mouth, is she more full or less empty? So when I was writing Miracle Arrhythmia, Hurricane Katrina happened, and I wrote a poem which I'm going to read to you called Hymn to a Hurricane, and it's about, and I think in the wonderful group of students I spoke with earlier today, kind of thinking about the lives and narratives of other people and trying to write toward or for or with them in solidarity or some kind of conversation. And this was my attempt. I experienced the hurricane through the screen, through a television screen, and so it was, an event to be watched on the news and kind of looked at in a way that dear friends of mine experienced by losing homes and loved ones. And at the end of the poem, you'll hear there was a particular interview of a man who, he's kind of standing there with 2 children, and he's completely devastated. And of course, the reporter runs up and puts this microphone in his face, and the camera's on, and he's just had this horrible moment where his house literally, split in half, and they're trying to climb up onto the roof, and his wife actually lets go of his hand so that he can help both their children get up on the roof. Hymn to a Hurricane. For the grace of fingers that could not grasp edges, corners, or anchors. For hands that were too wet to bridge the chasm of inches or rope. For the wrist and its bending digits, for the drowned infants who floated like wood past the dark ships of their mothers' bodies. For the days-old corpses of women and men whose wheelchairs became their graves. For children who were too shocked to speak their identities or allegiance. For the ghost of their voices that haunt our flag. For the rainbows that assembled in their waters, diseased with gasoline and blood. For the voices whose rage thundered like thunder inside the stadium because they refused the musky death of animals. For the men who fired guns at helicopters that passed over their own nearly submerged heads. Over and over, the blades word promises of water mothers and daughters, brothers and fathers drowned, their lives devoured by neglect. Lives gave up on the living and floated to dark, drier islands. Torrents rose over broken levees, dead cattle bobbed along interstates, highways unfurled into ribbons and graves. The president remained on vacation, while the Secretary of State shopped for shoes. For Charmaine Neville, who commandeered down Canal Street while storefronts shattered, helpless fists pounding bus windows like bullets. For the junkies there who needed something stronger than death or a dream. For the residents who refused to abandon the corpse of New Orleans. And for a husband who could not save his entire family because he only had 2 hands. For their house split in half by water. For his wife's last words, "You can't hold on and hold me." For the absence of God as she dropped his hands and gave herself like a petal to the gulf. And for her son who understood as he climbed onto the roof by the help of his father's trembling 2 hands, that his father, only a man and not a god, could not save his mother's life from something as inexplicable as water. And the last quote I'm going to read from Miracle Arrhythmia is, well, toward the end of this book, I was kind of deciding that I'd move to New York and be like a real artist, like a real poet. And somehow, for me, at that moment, that meant New York. I had a very dear friend, and I don't know if any of you have had that teacher in middle school or elementary school who like looks out for you and calls you out and thinks of you as a person and not just a student. And so I was fortunate enough to have this very magical teacher who encouraged me to write and read and do my art. And I was really that awkward girl in the corner, like looking at like bugs and drawing and reading comic books. And I was very lonely and I was kind of a loner. And so she really helped me learn about myself and that I was an artist. So this poem is for her. Declarations from Ghost. Some days I go to St. Monica's and touch the pews. I cannot pray to wood. Instead, I watch the old women who have outlived you. I study their wrinkled hands, hues of liver spots, the wedding rings slipping around their knuckles. I pray for absence before my own body will betray me. This brief cathedral of miracles. I study calendars while I sit in the pews counting empty boxes. The perfect empty days are vacant coffins, the comfort of numbers arriving day after day like condolences. I do not live like calendars anymore. My own time is the passing of light, dream, and love over my face, salt water drenching a rock. At the repast, I held your remains, the box less than 10 pounds, as though you were again an infant. The royal blue velvet softened the hard corners of your urn. I imagined your once beating heart, no more than a pound while you lived. Tell me you are dead, Suzanne. Declare it a certainty, so that in my dreams and days and daily roots, I will not pause and call for you. I will worship the grocery store, the cathedral, the yellow cafe, and the park, not stopping for ghosts who over and over call out your name. How's the human attention span? How's it going? Is it good? Is it okay? How's everyone doing? Okay. Well, I'm going to read a few poems from Lighting the Shadow, and I thought it was kind of interesting for me to read from my first collection and then to read from the most recent one. And then I will also read a few new poems, but I don't know what they want to be yet, so I'm not ready yet to call them a book, but they probably will be. And as you heard in the introduction, the first lines of this first poem in the book, which is called "The Dead Will Lead You." And what I need to tell you about this poem so that you don't think it's too weird. I often write ekphrastic poetry, which means I look at visual art, and from visual art I will create a piece of writing, a poem or a novel or an essay or some kind of written language. And in this book I connect, or try to connect, my identity as a photographer and a visual artist with language. And that, as I mentioned earlier, with the group of students I spoke to today when I was younger, that wasn't always such a great experiment. But as I've gotten older, it seems that those two spaces in me have something to say to each other. And so, in The Dead Will Lead You, there's an image of a child that I saw in a photograph, which kind of was the seed or the engine for the poem. And then it became something else, as poems often do. They transform us. The dead will lead you. The dead will lead you across scarred meadows, red, blue, white. The star-flung sky scrapes gold grass, unknown milk, endless stone figures in the fields. Who will embalm our bones? Shattered inside of mythologies, we are idols, praised by blood and sun. You will call and listen for the children cradled in moonlight, side by side, their silence deranged, deflowered by ghost primers. Years pulse the skull, the ashen hills, the expanse of desert shorn with prayers. You walk alone through mirages, museums, eyelids, water, estuaries, where wings repeat flight until this desire is memorized. This is what you must learn by heart, the closed flesh as commandment. A terracotta smear of fingerprints praying along the blue cave. Mercy is the pulse of lupin in a yellow field. My mother's eyes are forgotten vases of irises. Lighting the shadow, a woman crawls out beneath her own war. Ruin, I have lived inside your estate. I remember the night horses, reckless with my beauty, when the trembling poured through my windows. The animals surrounded my bed as we floated through the house, the world without sail, anchor, ornament, or oar. My memory was a painted mask, filled with the inviolate breath of what history can blow apart. This poem is called The Reckoning of Relics, and I was, a few years ago when I was working on these poems, I was at the Malay colony, which is a property called Steepletop, where the poet Edna St. Vincent Millay lived and where she died, and she's a favorite poet of mine because I love what she does with sound, and also during her time, she was kind of revolutionary as far as being a woman and writing poetry. And poets do these weird things. We'll go to some dead person's house and stay there and like write and, make things. And sometimes when we go to these places, there are tours. And so when I was at the Malay colony, I wanted a tour of her home. And the curator there, the director of the Malay Society, was kind of walking me through Malay's house. And when we got up to her bedroom, like I'm seeing her clothes and her gloves and like her fabulous wardrobe. And then he has this envelope and he's like, okay, I'm going to show you this really amazing thing. And when he opened the envelope and pulled out what was in it, it was her hair. And it kind of freaked me out because it's hair in an envelope. But it also made me just kind of amazed. And this St. Vincent Millay had this like gorgeous red hair, like really bright phoenix, jean gray kind of red hair. And so you could still see that fire of her in her hair. And so this poem is about my time there. The Reckoning of Relics. This is the gristle of imagery, the need to see what is past. Not history, not the before or long ago, but the saint's finger, the sarcophagus of imagery, the immortal phrases of headstones. Somewhere after death, a detail remains, sits in the mind, brightly impenetrable as a mineral, lapis lazuli or diamond. It was June in Austerlitz, and I was circling the stalls of my life, flinging kerosene over what I'd done wrong. There were so many mistakes. The stars slid over hummingbirds in the evening. Deer neared me, then turned away in the meadow's lumina. Beneath apple trees I sat and rubbed my hands across the bark of my own skin and the red compass within my rib cage. One afternoon, Peter walked me through Malay's house, asked me to imagine the house, the woman's work, her mask. I was staying in the barn, invisible from her windows, taking a month to heal the broken flames of my phoenix, the better woman in me prepared for flight. I walked for hours, miles, became a vapor, returned from ash, wrote to Tracy, climbed trees, met black snakes and barred owls, breathed like a firefly, alone, a frame of light in a museum, without a painting inside, without a self-portrait. In the morning, high grass floated beneath dew, and I listened to my new flesh, which was the truer poem. The listening saved me, even when my ears bled and my heart leaped. I stood at the window in my head and looked out at the loping black bear, the pinions of black crows, the thickets of youth flattening beneath my whispers. Upstairs, Peter held his palm out to me, the hush and eternity of a dead woman's curls, faded with threads of red. So just two more from, or maybe even one more, from Lighting the Shadow. One of the things, or one of the figures that arrived in this book as I was working on it was Frida Kahlo. And I spoke earlier with the students about Kahlo and her presence in this particular book, although I think in The Requited Distance, my second book, she shows up. But when I was trying to write these poems, I was writing these very, very terrible Frida Kahlo poems. They were exploited her, they were very generic. I had like Frida Kahlo socks, flower crown, Frida Kahlo magnets, like Frida Kahlo, stationery, everything. And I was about as far as Frida Kahlo as I could imagine creatively. And I decided that I needed to meet Kahlo on kind of her terms. And I flew down to Mexico City, and went to Coyoacán, which is the neighborhood where Casa Azul is located. And I went there for several days in a row and started to, like when you go through someone's house and like not snoop around, because they don't let you snoop in Frida Kahlo's house, but you start to really see a portrait of a person and what their life might be like. And instead of the kind of romantic Frida Kahlo I had been trying to project something on, I instead got to meet a woman artist who was real to me. And so I'm going to read a poem called July 13th, 1954. And what you need to know about this poem is that's Frida's death date. And Frida, being as wild as she was, and liking to prank people and play jokes on people, Kahlo was cremated, and as her body was going into the crematorium, for some reason the body sat up. And when it sat up, some of the fire and cinders from the cremation stove had kind of gotten into her hair already. And so she scared the heck out of everybody. And so this poem is kind of in conversation with that story of Kahlo. And there's an epigram from her, which is this: I live on air, accepting things as they come. July 13th, 1954. Because you sat upright, not yet ash, Frida. Already myth, yes, already. Spine broken into bone silence. You sat upright near fire, preparing as the phoenix must gather her fires to die. Lady Lazarus, whispering inside your silence, fitting the body into lightning, your faces painted and photographed, a furnace of dreams waiting in paradise. Because we gathered around your ribs, your hundreds of convex embraces and dignities, near the immortal needle of desire, you'll twist perpetually out of reach and paint, pleasure. Blazing your night hair and soft bones descend through the canopy of your bed to kiss your coverlet of skin. I never write an elegy for you, Frida, but once in late spring I lingered in a sky of laments at the top of the stairs in your house, the last room, on the last day. A young man with eyes like burning told me, she is still here, he said, pointing out your urn, shaped and brown, like a humble creature of the earth, pre-Columbian, two clay arms extended to hold your death in afterlife. I don't always tell where she is, he said in Spanish, his voice splitting like a fruit. Frida, there is a death mask of your face on the canopied bed. Above you, God waits like a mirror. In the corner, your painted leg in its red boot waiting to dance. I am talking to you, sister, naming comets and my deaths in your name. And so I'd like to just close with one poem, a new poem. And I'd also like to just close with a repetition of gratitude of being here and for being in this space and holding space with all of you. It's meant so much to me to be on the road and to experience such kindness from so many people these last days. And so I'm going to read a poem called, it's called Good Death. And what you need to know is it's an elegy, and I wrote it, my mother died in 2014, and if any of you here, I hope you haven't, but then you know that 2 years, 5 years, 7 years, 18 years, 20 years, 50 years doesn't really make a difference. And that the grieving process is a life unto itself. And so as I began that life without my mother, a question that got posed to me during the week of making arrangements for her burial, and those weeks are such a business of contracts and plots and food and picking out things and flowers that you almost can kind of forget what the actual core of that journey is. So one of the questions that more than one person asked me was whether my mother had had a good death. And this is a kind of concept that is a real thing, but in that moment, it felt very surreal to be asked that and for me to try to define that for myself. And so this poem, I think when I'm actively writing poems again, because right now there's just too much in me to try to write the story down of my mother's life, because then it feels over to me. Good death. Of words placed in their best black clothes, of that darkness full, of my mother's laugh forged of dust that spilled its gold light into her tomb, of the wreath carved upon her copper vault, of the ivory city bones like trumpets blowing you away from us in song, of the city again where my mother will be welcomed by doves and vultures, of the road between your dates, Mama, a short slash, of the pronunciation of sorrow, always for me now in summer, of the snake who suffered the story of knowledge, of the afterlife in its downpour of ordinary rites, of rites I enact in my broken thoughts, of my fever waving its anguish until the match goes out in disbelief, of the 9 stars bleeding mercy 1 year later beneath the roof of God, God, and God, of the peace and suffering my people have been promised, of the clean white clothes I gave the undertaker. Here are the stockings I said, not knowing whether they would match my mother's skin. Of the poems I've been trying to write, die, I say, go elsewhere for songs. Of the food and the appetite, of my father's shoulders in a black suit, of downpour again, of the animals who charge me with their horns when I offer my pentameter of ribs, of her visitations, of her hot comb I cradled on my knees in the bathroom, of the brutal gospel of hair, untouched toothbrush, clothes in closets with sales tags, of dreams where my teeth scatter like maple leaves of what I will never remember, of the rain that makes my howls float like empty bottles of glass, of the dreams where my white clothes grow flames, of what I will remember remembering, of the neon-colored nail polish on her hand I held at her deathbed, of what I hated to ask the night and gods, of my knees that remember the orange mud before the grass grew back, of it being over and over again and again, of it beginning. They asked me, was it a good death? Was it a good death? Was there peace for all of us? Why should I want peace instead of my mother? Of the mothers who have always known a truth I could not reach while holding children in their wombs. Why wasn't I told? Now into the sea with my jewel of anguish and shake these human flowers from my new bald skull. Thank you. So do we have time for questions?
Yeah.
Does anyone have a question? Has the human attention span done its work? We had a lot of good ones earlier that are still making me think. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about what you're working on now?
Sure. So I'm writing a novel. When I think about like what language thing I'm doing, I'm working on a novel. The novel is finished, but I'm now in revision mode, so I get to now look at how terrible it is and cut and pull my hair out and talk to my dog in a room by myself. But I'm writing a novel. I just recently presented, or I have a visual art show at Poets House in New York called American Stanzas, and it's a 10-year featured selection of photographs and mixed media and visual art of mine in my last 10 years, which makes me feel really old. And those are kind of, I think, the two main things that are coming to my mind now. I like to keep a lot of projects kind of going or in the wings, and so the main thing for me after this tour is getting the novel into much, much better shape. I feel like I've been feeding it a lot of fast food, and now it needs a lot of green juice. So that's where I'm at. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, hi.
Growing up, what was your favorite comic?
Growing up, what was my favorite comic? I really, really like X-Men and Spider-Man. It's pretty cool. Those would be my two. I'm the eldest of 4 children. I have 2 brothers right after me. So if I wanted to have friends, I had to get with the program. Yeah, so we climbed trees, and I learned how to draw actually from comic books, which is kind of amazing because the action and the storytelling and everything that happens. I just binge watched Luke Cage. Daredevil's too violent for me because it's so violent, so graphic. It's really good. What's the one, Jones? I watched a little bit of that one. Jessica Jones, and I was like, oh, I like Jessica, but I don't know if I might have to go back to that one. But I really like, have always really liked comics, and I feel like they're for everybody. Like, there's something about them. I like graphic novels too. My brother is a cartoonist, and he's writing and illustrating a graphic novel. So I always feel comfortable around people who like comic books. Thank you for your question. Hi.
What was the process of finding your voice growing up?
That's a great question. I would say it's a process that had ups and downs. You know, I was, as I might have mentioned before, I was the child from like age 3 or 4 who was always drawing and trying to tell a story or make a picture and trying to like share some narrative or something. I think, you know, as I got older, if I think, you know, back to around like college time, I think that's when I really started to struggle because there's such a pressure. I experienced pressure of, you need to go to law school, you need to go to medical school. Poems are not going to pay your rent, you can't eat, poems don't give you health insurance, you know. And so I had to think of ways to really structure the life that I wanted to live and not to isolate the dream from the living of the life. And so there have been a lot of moments where you know, I've had to bang my head on a brick wall, I've had to fail a lot, but I also had to reach out and ask people to help me and to remember that none of us live in a vacuum. And so in that moment when I'm thinking like, I'm depressed, I can't do this, No one else has had to fail the way I've had to fail. A sea of hands raise their hand and say, oh yeah, it could be worse, or don't worry, you're gonna be okay. And if I saw myself as a younger woman walking down the street, I'd be like, relax, calm down, it's gonna be fine. But really, I've always really loved school, so I was in school a long time until I realized I was hiding in school, and that I was using school as a way to keep me in a shape without taking the risk I needed to give myself permission to write and paint. And the photography came when I moved to New York. I lived in an apartment that wasn't even as big as this stage. It was probably the size of that piano. And so I couldn't have an easel and natural light and like my palette brushes and all this stuff. And so I started to take a camera around in New York and started to take pictures. And all that time I always wrote. And maybe a year and a half into living in New York, I decided I'd go get an MFA at Sarah Lawrence College because I needed community. I had no community. I'm very actually introverted and shy and kind of melancholy and needs a lot of solitude. But I realized I was having too much solitude and I needed community and friends to read my work and for me to read theirs and for us to talk about language and go to poetry readings and just really see like the full spectrum of the humanity of what art shares and tells us about ourselves and tells us about other people. And so, in the last few years, my art life is more of a professional life, but I see it as more of, there's still that really messy room where I throw paint and other things against the wall. When I come out of that room, there's another room where it's my job. But my job is to always show up and be present for my art. And so that's what I try to do. And I always, as I said before, I never take it for granted when I get to be in front of a group of people, which makes me feel so vulnerable, but at the same time, I'm so fortunate that at this point in my life, I've been able to merge the spinal cords of the dream and the nurturing and cultivation and like the business of it. So that's some of what I would say. In an hour, I'll give you a completely different answer. So I'm a little brain dead right now, but I think that's an answer, and the answer is always evolving. Thank you for that question. Yes.
Could you speak a little bit to the conversation between the space of language and visual art?
I would place them in the same space. They really orbit. My brain is like, wow. We'll see what happens at the art talk. I'll just point at pictures and say that's me. To me, it's kind of like a constellation, and so different things flare up, different things fall out of the sky. They share a space. Sometimes, the language and imagery have things to say to each other, but they're always connected. I used to try to isolate them and keep them away from each other because I didn't really have, I really hadn't developed techniques and strategies, and I didn't know my voices clearly yet about how those two, what the possibilities and potential are for those two spaces in me to collaborate. So now they really love to collaborate within me, and so I like to make three-dimensional poems. I like to make weird, strange little videos that you can find online about like language and poetry. I like to take photographs and portraits of other writers, musicians, artists. I love musicians. And so I let things kind of be without immediately trying to say, put a label on something. Like let it breathe a little before I kind of confine it into one thing. And those spaces, I get to be different parts of myself in each of those spaces. The photographer is very different in tone and kind of when I'm in that mode, it's a bit different than the page, and its needs are different. And what has to happen when I'm working on photographs isn't completely different from language, but it's not the same tools in a way. Although I will say, for example, with lighting the shadow, I tried to take the language and making of photographs to the page. So the presence of like light and shadow and cropping and framing work and texture, like the grain and the grayscale. I tried to bring that into poems to talk about how messy and complicated our human experiences are, and how photographs in a way are these strange spaces where we see things, this act of seeing happens, and that it's a very kind of wild, democratic order, but also disorder in a way. I mean, I could just go on endlessly, but I won't here, obviously, because we need to go out in the world. I need to see a deer here, seriously. I've been told that the deer situation here is like the best, so I don't see deer in Brooklyn. But my mind is kind of, the gears in my mind are like, constantly turning, here's the image, here's the language, and they do all these wonky things together. And now I celebrate it